When the moon hits your eye like a big piece of pie, that's amore.
Hey people, Raz here. Do you like pizza? Does pasta sauce flow through your veins? Do you go like this when you talk? Well, I've got good news for you. Today's video is about another cannon. It fought in the spaghetti-infested Italian Alps. Honestly, until I did research on this topic, I wasn't really sure if Italy was a real place. However, after watching 5 Martin Scorsese films, I can assure you it is real. And believe me, they deserve to be invaded. So, without further ado, let's meet our contestants. On the left, we have the newly formed Kingdom of Italy. This kingdom is only 40 years old and has lost every major conflict they've fought in so far. On the right, we have the abomination of nation-states known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Equivalent to a modern-day UN, it was comprised of 12 separate kingdoms who didn't speak the same language that had Voltron together into an even larger kingdom. Who will win? Well, let's find out on today's episode, the Isonzo River Campaign. The Isonzo River Campaign has kind of become a historical meme. This is one of those weird situations where you really have to question how stupid your leadership was. I shit you not, there were 12 battles of the Isonzo River. Why? Well, nobody knows. The ground wasn't that advantageous. The Austro-Hungarians held the heights for most of the conflict, and the front stretched over such long high ground that taking one peak wouldn't hold any advantages against the other peaks, or be strategically significant enough to justify the amount of losses. It became a literal meat grinder where the Italian army was forced to charge uphill against well-entrenched Austro-Hungarian forces that held the high ground. And what can only be described as a feat of futility, the Italian army chief of staff, Luigi Cadorna, forced his men to charge again and again into certain death. I can find almost no rational reason why anyone would do this. When Italian forces would fail to take the heights, Luigi Cadorna would just call his men cowards and say they didn't take it because they lacked the fighting spirit. He even decided to cut out the middleman and just off his own troops. He reintroduced a ancient Roman practice called the decimation, where every 10th man was killed if their unit failed to take their objective. If your unit was charged with cowardice, 9 of the other men had to choose one man to kill, and then they would tie him into a pole and collectively execute the soldier. As if this wasn't bad enough, Cadorna went on to form veritable death squads called the Arditi, whose sole job was to throw away their lives and launch suicide raids on enemy positions with the hopes that they would capture or kill some of the Austro-Hungarian forces along the way. In all the battles, he didn't change his tactics at all, proving that Neanderthals never really went extinct. In fact, they were promoted to the highest ranks in the Italian army. In his galaxy-brain decision-making, he decided that every battle should be done the same way. He would bombard the enemy positions, warning them that they were coming. Then, he would have his men charge up a hill against their barbed wire and machine guns until most of them had died. Then finally, he would call a general retreat and start shooting his own soldiers for cowardice. Occasionally, they would capture ground, or in the best cases, kill more Austro-Hungarians than they took as casualties. But at the end of the day, they were always pushed back again, so it all meant basically nothing. Even though, in most of the battles, the Italians had numerical superiority, they typically would lose 2 for every 1 Austro-Hungarian killed. It went on and on like this for a staggering 2 years and 5 months, a total of 881 days. More than 1.2 million people perished in the meat grinder that was the Isonzo River. So, before I begin, I want to give you the background on these two nations real quick. I didn't know this before I did research, but Italy, as we know it, is a relatively new nation. The short version is, the Kingdom of Italy was comprised of a ton of different micro-kingdoms that had been separate for the last 800 years. Italy itself had not been one nation since the days of the Romans. On the Italian side, you have Army Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna, who was a wealthy aristocrat from the former Kingdom of Sardinia, who was basically gifted his position just because of his family status. Cadorna was extremely insubordinate and took orders from no one, not even the king. He was also known for firing and killing off his subordinates if they tried to debate his battle strategies. In his time, he fired over 200 generals and 300 colonels. This brings us to the Frankenstein nation that is Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was almost as discombobulated as the UN is today. It was 12 different nation-states that combined to become one central Slavic powerhouse. And their armies, while massive, were very disorganized due to the language and cultural barriers. They were led by one of the most capable leaders in the Austro-Hungarian army, Svetozar Barojevich von Bonya. Throughout the war, he was able to hold back the Italian army many times, being outnumbered 2-1, 3-1, and in some cases 12-1. The Austro-Hungarians worked absolute miracles by holding on as long as they did. Near the end of the conflict, some units were using black powder muskets, wicker shoes, and only eating once a day. They were a nation of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slavs, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovenians, Romanians, Italians, Croats, and Serbs. World War I would be the coming of age for Italy and the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, join me today as I go over the 12 battles of the Isonzo River campaign and our Cobi of the day, the 100mm field howitzer. This weapon was used by both sides since it was often captured as the ground kept exchanging hands throughout the campaign. So, whether you were Italian or Austro-Hungarian, you were probably using this gun. Beggars can't be choosers. So, why the Isonzo? Well, anyone with a brain could look at a map of northern Italy and say, whoa, damn, that's a lot of mountains, and you'd be right. Both sides knew the only way to break out of Italy was to go through the Venetian lowlands into Slovenia. Because of this, the Austro-Hungarians spent the weeks before the conflict setting up massive defenses along the border since they knew that's where they would attack from. So now, let's get started. The first battle of the Isonzo, in many ways, was a carbon copy of the next 5 battles to come. Guess what Cadorna's main strategy was? If you said frontal assault, you were right. Cadorna fired an artillery strike along the whole line and then ordered his men to charge and take Mount Sabatino, Mount St. Michel, and Gorizia. Since the artillery was so scattered, all it did was alert the Austrians to their plan. So they set up a machine gun crossfire and gunned down their troops as they charged towards the river. No ground was taken.
Yeah, I'd like to solve the puzzle.
All right, go ahead.
Yep.
That's it, yeah.
The second battle of the Isonzo had the exact same plan. The only difference was that the Italians actually took Mount St. Michel and Mount Bacanica. Unfortunately, Cadorna didn't resupply his forces, so they ran out of ammo and had to retreat. No ground was taken, and both sides went back to their starting lines.
Oh shit. Here we go again.
Now get this, the third battle of the Isonzo actually had a plan. Since blindly charging at machine guns hadn't worked out well for them, he decided he was going to actually focus on certain objectives this time. He wanted 2 forces to distract Mount St. Michel and Mount Sabatino, and then he would move a force over the bridge to capture the city of Gorizia. It's almost like he's learning in real time. He also amassed all 1,200 of his big guns in that same area and made them fire at just those 2 objectives. This actually ended up working. He captured and managed to hold Gorizia for an entire day, and then was pushed back by a charge led by Svetozar Barojevich von Bonya. This is where von Bonya earned his nickname, the Croatian Thickhead, because he refused to listen to his field commanders and ordered thousands of them to their deaths, taking back Gorizia. This battle also was the first battle where the Italian troops were issued steel helmets. As it turns out, the granite that made up the Dolomite mountain range would splinter into glass-like shards, and when a bullet or shell fragment would hit the rocks, it would send shrapnel flying everywhere like a pipe bomb, causing deep wounds and often leading to blindness in the troops. At the end of the day, no ground was taken.
Do it.
The fourth battle of the Isonzo was a play-by-play repeat of the third, except both sides got reinforcements and the weather had turned the battlefield into a snowy hellscape. The heaviest fighting was the attack on Mount Sebusi. This is where the importance of artillery became paramount. While Cadorna didn't know how to effectively use it yet, the upcoming winter would allow his spotters to spot the enemy positions and place his cannons to allow them to fire at the Austrian strongpoints. In the end, no ground was taken by either side this battle, and both sides ended up retreating to regroup for the long winter.
And this is where I put it.
Successful Isonzo offensives.
If I had one!
It was a new year, and the armies were recharged after a long winter. It's a perfect time for the fifth battle of the Isonzo. The Italians were coordinating with the Allies to try to keep pressure off of Verdun and decided to launch a large diversionary offensive to help. The French decided to supply them with 1,300 new heavy cannons. However, the bombardment was ineffective because they shelled positions along the whole perimeter rather than concentrating fire. They managed to finally capture the western edge of Mount Sabatino in the north, but no other ground was captured. The fun new thing to do was to capture parts of mountains and then try to tunnel under the enemy positions to try to lay massive mines to blow the enemy up. This was the first area where this tactic was attempted, but they never ended up getting close enough to the enemy positions to try it. Also, fun fact, this front was known as the home of the flower Edelweiss. Originally it was used as a symbol to prove your love to a woman, and it was adopted by German and Austro-Hungarian forces stationed in the Alps since it was hard to find. You'd have to be very daring to reach it. Due to this, the German and Austro-Hungarian Gebirgsjäger forces inherited this as its primary symbol.
Did I ever tell you what the definition of insanity is? Insanity is doing the exact same fucking thing over and over again, expecting to change. That is crazy.
Following up Conrad von Hutzendorf's Trentino offensive, Cadorna snuck about 100,000 more troops in from the battle and began preparing for a massive coordinated assault. For the first time, he coordinated his 1,400 guns and focused it on just 3 sectors instead of the entire front. And he had the Italian infantry tie white discs to their backs so the artillery could see where they were. This allowed the howitzers to fire ahead of the infantry since the line of sight to their objectives was near perfect. Because of this, the Austro-Hungarian defenders were completely overwhelmed. Artillery pounded their defenses to smithereens, and then the infantry swept in and took objective after objective. They captured Gorizia, Mount San Michele, Mount Calviero, Podgora Hill, and the peak of Mount Sabatino. The entire defense was routed. Thankfully for the Austro-Hungarians, a fresh batch of reinforcements arrived within 3 days after the fighting had died down in Russia. Unaware of how thoroughly Cadorna had beaten the enemy, he took his time moving up his guns and completely lost the initiative of the offensive. By the time he had moved his men up, 3 days had passed. The Austro-Hungarian forces had regrouped in the Valona Valley with a fresh batch of reinforcements. Cadorna decided to call off the battle.
One does not simply walk into
Slovenia.
The 7th battle was the most mountainous terrain they had fought on yet. Despite the fact that the Italian forces greatly outnumbered the Austro-Hungarians, they were able to hold the defense. The mountains provided glacial snow for the men to dig trenches and tunnels into, making troop movements almost invisible to both sides. The Italians sent in their elite Alpini troops. The Alpini were Italy's elite ski troopers. They were trained in mountain climbing. Many hauled artillery up 100-foot sheer cliffs. This artillery was later used to trigger avalanches against both sides. During this battle, an avalanche led to the deaths of 10,000 Italian and Austro-Hungarian men. It came to be known as the White Death. Ljubljana and Mount Ramban had held against the massive assaults. At the end of the fighting, only Nova Vas had fallen. The Austro-Hungarian defenders held the high ground and repelled wave after wave. At this point, food, morale, and ammunition was running low on the Austro-Hungarian side. They had started drafting 40 and 50-year-old men into the army with next to no training. Some units were given muskets because the traditional rifles had ran out. Most of the new troops were given paper or straw shoes since they were out of leather boots, and their uniforms usually were covered in blood because they were stripped off the dead and dying. These mountains would turn into fortresses, and were impossibly hard to take because of the steep terrain. Only small units of men could be moved at the same time because most of the mountains had sheer cliffs from the attackers' side. The Austro-Hungarians would roll boulders down at the enemy to save ammo. Some battles were fought hand-to-hand because these positions were so hard to resupply. After this battle, both sides would settle in for a long war of attrition. Day after day, raids and artillery would become the norm.
I fear no man, but that thing, it scares me.
For the 8th Battle of the Isonzo, Cadorna launched a 2-prong attack with the Duke of Aosta. Their men rushed up the hills, and for a moment it looked like the Italians had broke through. But throughout the week, the Austro-Hungarians pushed them back to their starting lines with some of the most fierce fighting taking place on Hill 144. There, they were fighting hand-to-hand with clubs and bayonets. One soldier said it was like he had been sent back to the Middle Ages. Nova Vas was retaken after a brutal artillery barrage destroyed over half of the Austro-Hungarian defenders. The rest surrendered immediately.
Ah, that's hot.
The 9th Battle of the Isonzo was a carbon copy of the 8th. Cadorna wanted one last try before winter shut down the whole front for 6 months. In the end, no ground was taken and both armies settled in for a long winter. This would be brutally cold and would cause hundreds of men to get frostbite. Desertions were high during this point in the war. Cadorna decided to reenact the ancient Roman practice of decimation. In the end, around 750 soldiers were executed for cowardice. Hey, General Cadorna, can we go home now?
What? Sorry, but no.
The Italians had spent months planning their new summer offensive. They opened up with 3,000 French, Polish, English, and Italian howitzers bombing every entrenched Austro-Hungarian defense. Since they had actually taken time to plan and range find, they were deadly accurate. A majority of the losses on the Austro-Hungarian side would be to artillery because of this battle. Hill 383 was the first to fall to the Italians. They had attacked it in so many waves that eventually the Austro-Hungarian defenses ran out of ammo and fell apart. Zagora was next to fall. After that, Mount Santo had fallen. Next was Mount Vodes. Eventually, a sneak attack by the Austro-Hungarian mountain troops captured back Mount Santo, but the Italians firmly held the rest of the ground.
Wow. Let's do that again. No.
The 11th Battle of the Isonzo was designed to capture the city of Trieste. Enrico Caviglia had spotted all the entrenchments across the line, and they were able to bomb all the enemy positions in his sector. They still had to cross the river in his sector, though, so he constructed semi-permanent pontoon bridges to make the crossing easier. The Duke of Aosta was able to surround the Czech rifles, and they secured the Benitza Plateau and Mount Santo. Aided by ship artillery strikes, he was able to push the enemy to their third line of defenses, just 10 miles away from the city of Trieste. It looked as though the Italians were on the cusp of winning the campaign. For those of you who don't know, the 12th Battle of the Isonzo was actually the Battle of Caporetto. Unlike the rest of the battles, this was a combined German and Austro-Hungarian offensive. Svetozar Barojevich von Banya had been begging the Germans for help since last year. This battle, the Germans would send it. Fearing that if they did nothing, Austria-Hungary would be knocked out of the war, Paul von Hindenburg said, you can borrow these guys for like 3 or 4 months, but we need them back for the Western Front, okay? Germany had just lent the Austro-Hungarians roughly 10,000 piecemeal troops from various divisions. Basically, they were the leftovers from different army groups and specialized units that weren't part of a larger battalion. Otto von Bellow would lead the German forces and made plans for an offensive with von Bonya. It was decided that they would launch a gas attack on Caporetto and then detonate 2 mines in the heights to blow away their defensive positions, and then they would have a sweeping artillery barrage, using the 2,200 big guns to wipe away any of the extra resistance. Turns out this plan worked so well that the Germans would actually advance more than 20 miles in the first day. At 6 a.m., the Germans used Livens projectors mounted to the heights to send 6.5 tons of phosgene gas into the valley below. Some 600 men were sleeping when they were gassed. Many suffocated just inches away from their own bed. The rest of the defenders retreated since Italian gas masks were so ineffective they would only last roughly 2 hours. The artillery shredded them as they ran away. A young lieutenant named Erwin Rommel would lead a group of mountain troops during this battle. They would go on to capture 9,000 Italians and 3 mountain peaks. Even years later, during World War II, he would remark that this was the high point of his career. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians were able to penetrate a total of 20 miles into Italian territory on just the first day alone. This caused Cadorna to panic and tell his forces to retreat all across the line. They were running to catch up with the Germans, and by day 3 they had finally caught up and began to mount a defense. At this time, the Germans and Austrians had pushed the Italians back over 60 miles from their old positions. They were now within spitting distance of Venice. Seeing how there was no way they could possibly lose this battle, the Germans were called back early to the Western Front following the successful offensive. Italian morale was now at an all-time low. Many of the troops said Germany and Austria were not the real problem here, Cadorna was. He was finally fired and replaced by Enrico Caviglia. Fearing this might knock Italy out of the war, the Entente sent roughly 100,000 British and French troops to defend the city of Venice. They were greeted as heroes. They helped hold the line until fall of 1918. By that point, Austria-Hungary was suffering from political unrest, and they decided to absolve the monarchy. What ensued was a complete collapse of Austria-Hungary's government and the abdication of the king. The Habsburg regime was over, and the entire empire of Austria-Hungary was no more. Amidst all this chaos, the Austro-Hungarian army fell apart. Many troops just dropped their weapons and began marching home. In the end, the Italians would walk back to their borders with little or no resistance. That was the great irony of this front. No matter how hard you fought, your nation's leadership were eventually what would let you down in the end. Anyways, time for the review. But first, let's see what gifts God King Cobi has provided for us today. Ah, it's a fine red wine made with Sangiovese grapes. Fun fact, the Italian temperance movement peaked in 1913. Initially, the Italians went to war with no alcohol at all. Cadorna soon realized he'd need his soldiers all liquored up to perform all those frontal assaults. So, by about 1915, he allowed a half-liter per soldier per day. Sangiovese grapes have been, and remain to be, one of the most commonly used grapes in Italy. Red wines made using this grape were the most common beverages consumed by Italian troops, and later by German troops after the Battle of Caporetto. Sadly, as the Italians retreated, they left nearly 5 million liters of red wine and 1,600 liters of cognac. Jokingly, they said that's what finally slowed the Germans down. As they captured the mass amounts of wine, they began chugging it, and some got so drunk they stopped advancing. While that's debatable, there are records of soldiers being executed for being drunk on duty around that time. But anyways, on to the review. The 100mm Howitzer was used a lot during World War I by the Austro-Hungarians and later the Italians. These cannons would be hauled to the tops of mountains due to their relatively light weight and ease to disassemble and reassemble. While it may not look like it, this cannon is nearly 4,000 pounds, or 225 kilograms. It really puts these pictures into perspective. This cannon would serve in Russia, Slovenia, and Italy during World War I, and then it would go on to see use in World War II by Poland and Germany. After 1942, most were retired and set up as defensive units. But now let's take a look at the model itself. This model is fairly basic, but there are some standout features that make it shine. This is the 1919 variant of this cannon. Cannons like this were used by the Austro-Hungarians during the war, but they had shorter stem-nose designs. The longer barrel allowed it to fire further and improved the accuracy at range. My favorite part of this model is the back. They managed to squeeze the detail of the breech into the design of this gun. I'm also a big fan of the wheels because they have an impressive amount of detailing. The spade on the back and the ridges of the barrel are also something that's characteristic of this gun, so I'm glad they were able to build them into this model. My only real complaints with this cannon are the tail and the recoil cradle. The tail doesn't quite look like the real tail. They were able to get it a lot closer on the 155mm Howitzer. The recoil cradle is also missing its typical dimple, which is why it's sad because they literally could have fixed this with just one piece. Overall, I think this is a great model for collectors. However, I wouldn't recommend it for young kids because it's very delicate. At the end of the day, my only complaints are easy enough to fix that I really can't fault the model. I know the main reason the tail detail wasn't included was because of its size. Thankfully, it's built to perfect 1/35 scale. Overall, I'd give this model a 9 out of 10. It's a great model with good details and a cool reminder of the Italian front. Before I go, I do want to say a few words about this front. It was impossibly hard to do research for this video, and there aren't many English sources documenting the action that took place here. Thankfully, I was able to find a lot of Italian and Slovenian sources that had great documentation and helped me make my maps and gave me some deeper insight to what it was like to actually fight on this front. So special thanks to all those local historians that made this video possible. I could not have done it without you. Overall, I find it an absolute shame that this front isn't better remembered. Today, this battleground is one of the most well preserved since most of the entrenchments were made of stone, and a lot of them still exist today. In some places, you can still find the guns guarding the desolate peaks. You can visit the monuments or crawl through the caves. Even on Google Earth, you can still see the shell craters littering the hills. This battlefield is an absolute treasure, and a testament to living history. Thank you for watching. As usual, you're all truly wonderful. Up next will be the A7V, so stay tuned for next time.